a lot of people will be scanning through the index and they'll be thinking, Jesus, how has that club gone there? And how that club's more sustainable than that club. How is that the case? Bro, so welcome everyone. Massive thank you for Adam Davis for joining us today and joining the Goal Assist community. We're here today to discuss something that has been a long time coming for me and Adam, which is the launch of the Fair Game Index. Before we go into talking about the index and fair game, everything in specifically, would you mind sort of just introducing a little bit of your background, Adam, on sort of your expertise? How did you get involved with fair game and things like that?
Yeah, no problem at all. Pleasure to be here, first off. So, as I said, my name's Adam Davis. I am a lecturer of sports business at UCFB in Manchester, but I also run my own consultancy, Davis Sports Management. A lot of my background is in football finance. I got into the world of professional sport around about, goodness me, probably 7 years ago now. And it's been a really interesting journey that I've been on that's sort of moved. It's all been around data, and that's been very much my underlying sort of work that I've always been within, but has very much moved in terms of how that data has been used and in what capacities. So I've worked for recruitment companies, I've worked for agents, I've worked for clubs themselves within those recruitment departments at times, and then very much transitioned into the world of football finance within the last 3 years now. Very much the COVID in many ways was actually, obviously it defined a lot of people's lives, but it defined mine very much in a good way, actually. So my background started in the world of research. I have a degree in economics from the University of York and a master's in sports management from Sheffield Hallam. And it was at Sheffield Hallam where I first really took this side of the business of sport sort of properly seriously. I think whilst I was working, or whilst I was at York, I knew I wanted to have something to do with sport, but it was very much something that hadn't been, I guess the level of detail around sport and sports academia was very limited at the time. You know, we've all read things like Soccernomics and stuff like that was there, but actually, how does that affect little me who was at York, who just wanted to work in sports data? Whilst being a part of Sheffield Hallam, I was approached by two very well recognised sports finance experts in the form of Dr. Dan Plumley and Professor Rob Wilson to join them on a project which was a UKRI research into the effect of COVID on football finance, government backed, and the idea was that COVID had ruined the finances of football. This was the initial proposal, but actually what we explained throughout all the research is that actually the finances of football have been broken for a very, very long time. And it really gained a real interest into the business side of sport that's kept going and going and going. We set up the consultancy to sort of help deliver on these data-based solutions to clubs. We've done it in a variety of different packages, things like sort of financial due diligence to actually put a price on these football clubs, as well as getting clubs to better understand their data as time's gone on. It's meant I've gone to really interesting places across the world. I've had the pleasure, I think, of working in, I think now 7 different sports in 9 different countries in the last 3 and a bit years, which has been a real pleasure. But yeah, always been about data, always been about sport, and here we are now, very much in one of those sort of big forefronts in where that data goes.
Yeah, but I mean, for those who are watching, I've worked with Adam. Sort of, it is quite an interesting point because it's sort of where the story then collides, is where Adam unfortunately meets me as we both our careers sort of intersect, as we both see and sort of get involved with the Fair Game project. For those who don't know who Fair Game are, listening to this, Fair Game originally, still founded by Niall Cooper. And he basically saw that sort of governance, especially in football, is broken with his experience working at AFC Wimbledon and obviously the troubles they had with obviously the formation of MK Dons. And essentially what they realized is that there was a requirement for an independent regulator in English football. And now sort of took on this mission to gather as many MPs and as many football clubs together to sort of rally around this issue in football governance. And that's where sort of me and Adam then sort of saw this project, realized this is something that's really interesting and is going to shape the rest of the game. Briefly, for those who don't know me, I'm not going to give you my whole spiel, but essentially I was at the EFL at the time, and we started to get whispers of an independent regulator might be coming in, and sort of my role at the EFL was club financial reporting. so monitoring and sort of enforcing financial regulations across the 72 member clubs. What I saw was this independent regulator is going to change the game for finance and regulation in football, and seeing that Fair Game's position and how they were supporting the independent regulator and how sort of the positive, even just the macro community values that Fair Game held was sort of why I got involved with Fair Game. And that's where I met Adam. So it'd be interesting now to hear, obviously, we've heard your background, which is really interesting. So at what point did you, I mean, I know the answer to this, but what brought Fair Game to your attention? And sort of how did you then sort of start that journey?
Yeah, so I've known about Fair Game probably for about, well, probably as long as DSM's been running, really. But I got approached or worked in collaboration with Niall around about 2 years ago. I was working still for Sheffield Hallam, and basically there was a sort of a mini sports webinar that Niall was on, talking about his mission and the stuff that they've been doing. And I was really impressed. And as I say, a lot of the academic research that I've worked in over the years has always been built around this idea that there is a need for a greater regulation, and actually we're in a position where that regulation can be molded by experts, and it's not something that's long standing. We are, very much we're at that cusp of something new, and I really wanted to get involved. So my background, as I said, was in sports data. I had a financial database which I wanted to continue to use. My ethos throughout all of my work has always been doing interesting stuff with interesting people. And this was very much the next extension of that. So I started working just under 2 years ago with Fair Game, which, as we say, nicely intersected within about 2 weeks of when you rocked up. So between the two of us, we both got drafted into the finance team. We worked very closely with a man called Dr. Mark Midling at Northumbria University, who very much was our sort of key gateway into sort of how Fair Game ran and actually what we could build together. But at the time, it was a very small organization, so we met all the sort of the key people very, very quickly, and it's been lovely to see the reputation and the amount of people associated with Fair Game to really grow in what is ultimately a very short space of time. Met some very, very interesting people in that time. So it's been a very exciting time. It's been a massive learning curve, and actually it's fantastic to see that whilst the outside world continues to rumble on, there are some real positives to pull from where football might go. And if Fair Game contributed to that, and indirectly ourselves, then I'm very pleased with how things have gone.
Yeah, absolutely. We talk about Fair Game generally there, and it's great for those who especially don't really have the background and understanding of how long the Fair Game project has been going on. This isn't something new, although obviously there's lots of media attention. There will be lots of media attention, especially around today with the launch of the index, to give people a background of how the progression of Fair Game as an organization, but also sort of like the positive direction it's been heading. So now we come on to the index itself. Obviously, ourselves worked on the index last time round. So let's just generally explain, for those who don't understand, what is the index? What has been the progression on last year? Why is it different? How is it different? And sort of just generally, what is it all about?
Yeah, sure. So the Fair Game Index for me is a giant study on the overall health of football. Lots of those people that are aware of sports business generally will have heard of things like the Deloitte Money League, which is very much an assessment of the finances of the very top end of the game. And we see the huge sums of money that some clubs have got access to. We're also well aware that that isn't applicable across all of football, and certainly not across all nations. And the Fair Game Index looks at four pillars that really we believe are important to all stakeholders in the game. That's not just the clubs themselves, that's the staff within them, players and non-playing staff. Fans, obviously a huge stakeholder in the game that at times are either forgotten about or seen as the enemy in sometimes towards certain ambitious projects. But ultimately, we need to appreciate all and include all. So those four pillars that we look at are financial sustainability, which is where we first started, the element of good governance, which is very much a detail on who is running the football club and how is it being run. Are you running this as a business? Not in a way where people claim that football isn't a business, but actually, are you doing the things that keep good businesses running? The other final pieces are equality standards, which is a huge part of the game, and the growing community that is football. It's rightly becoming more and more diverse in all ways. The appreciation of women's football, it's multinational, has been for many, many years, but there's a great level of recognition towards that beyond just, the nationalities of the players on the field. It's so much more than that. And then finally, fan and community engagement. So we look at those four pillars, which ultimately come down to 100 points, and how these clubs score on these four pillars. The pillars are weighted slightly differently, and I'm sure we'll come on to that as time goes on. But that's very much a study into the overall health of football, of which, based on I think sort of the wide remit in which the Fair Game Index looks at, is unprecedented in terms of its research.
100%. I mean, the way in which we've seen the progression year on year, I believe it was around about 80 touch points in which data was collected on last time round, sort of 2023's index. This year round, we're looking at well over 200 touch points, collecting data around all these core pillars. To give some sort of understanding to that, we spoke about the four pillars there. What sort of, like, for the people who are just like, well, how do you actually measure like fan engagement? How do you measure like finance? Like, what are some examples of the way in which these core pillars were measured? So like you say, we alluded to the scoring system there. Sort of, how is it scored, and what general sort of questions? Obviously, we're not going to go through all 200 plus, but in terms of what are the general sort of key areas within each of the pillars?
No problem at all. So the Fair Game Index, as I say, is you're right. It's up to, I think, 220 touch points this year. There was a need to increase the complexity of the index compared to last year, because football is an incredibly complex issue, and to be able to collect more questions and therefore be able to better reflect how these clubs are really doing was incredibly important to us. Of course, we've massively expanded the amount of clubs we look at as well. Last year we looked at down as far as the 92, and now we've expanded that down to the National League North and South, as well as all four leagues in Scotland. So, and there's been some really good feel-good stories in all those leagues, as well as ones where we want the improvement as well. In terms of key questions, I think the overwhelming point to the Fair Game Index is that this is all publicly available data. So this hasn't come from industry sources. This hasn't come from, being closer to some clubs or not, as the case may be. This is a case of, for me, the Fair Game Index is as much a measure of transparency. And this includes sort of financial sustainability. So something that we're looking at there is how and how much clubs report to the wider public. They all have to deliver sort of key management accounts to their respective leagues to see how they're getting on financially. But do they go to that next step and show the supporters or show other key stakeholders how that club is truly performing? There's no legal right for some clubs at certain levels to do this, but there are many clubs in that same league who are earning a similar amount of money, we hypothesize, that are giving that level of transparency, and we're seeing really good results of those that do. So we're very much looking at, within finances, we'll be looking at the overall financial health of the club, how much is being spent. There is a measure on profit, for example, but we also look at things like ground ownership. We're looking at sponsorship, not just the amount that is, but where those sources of sponsorship are coming from. Are they sustainable means? Are we looking at we're looking at things like ticket pricing. Do clubs comply with the 20s Plenty scheme, for example, something that's really, really important to fans that do travel across the country to go and to see their team, whether they're playing at the very, very top of the pyramid or not. It's as important at all levels. Within governance, we have quite a lot we're looking at things like board composition, who is on the board, how long they've been on the board, and the type and what kind of accountability is held against them. Adjacent to that are the policies employed within the business. So this is things like anti-slavery policies, or making sure that all those types of things that you would expect at any other business are being kept to and deployed to, and more importantly, continually improved as the football club becomes more and more complex as time goes on. And basically, are these clubs running like proper businesses when it comes to things that really matter, which is ultimately people? We move on to that. Of course, we then go on to equality standards, that the types of people involved in football, there are more and more backgrounds and more things to consider than we used to expect. We're not living in a world now where those that worked at the high end in the back office of a football club are people that were former footballers who've been at the club for 30 to 40 years. Now, of course, there are always some like that are talented, but that talent pool has massively grown over time. We look at equality standards through the usual things. So we're looking at ethics, we're looking at equality, both in gender, in race, in disability, but also we're looking at things like environmental policies. So actually, your impact on the wider world as a football club. This isn't just, are you turning the lights off at the end of the match and all these other things. It's so much more than things like this. We're looking at stuff like the rise of veganism, and actually, do you cater for people that are choosing that way of life? That obviously has an effect on your environmental impact. Really, really important. And the final one is the supply chain. So we're looking at not just where are you getting, what food are you getting or what supplies are you getting, but how are they coming about? How is it being acquired? Are you making sure that your suppliers compete with an anti-slavery policy? Where are you getting your sources of food or other resources that a club needs beyond just the people themselves? And then we finally come on to fan and community engagement, which is ultimately a measure of fan engagement. This is both formal and informal sort of stakes within the club. So those that will have good fan engagement are clubs who will potentially have fan representation on the board, either in its entirety. There are plenty of clubs that are fan owned up and down England and Scotland. Hearts, Exeter City, Partick Thistle, Scarborough Athletic, clubs like that. All different types of the pyramid, but also measuring what they're doing. If there isn't a formal representation on the board, how transparent are you being to fans? Are you publishing things like meeting notes from the key stakeholders and the shareholders of the club? Not necessary to open up to scrutiny, but very much a case of an openness on that this club matters an awful lot to an awful lot of people. And are you truly taking that into consideration? The final one, of course, is that expands that not just to fans, but the local community. So many clubs claim that they are a community asset to the people around them that aren't necessarily football fans, but they're a source of employment for many people. How seriously are you really taking that? How and what? Not necessarily do you see it as a thing to do, but what additional steps are you really taking to feel like you're better representing that community? Because every community is important surrounded in football. You can be in Lincoln or central London or the Highlands of Scotland, and ultimately that football club is just as important to those people no matter where you are, even if there's 300 people there or 30,000. It doesn't matter.
100%. I think one of the key things that we see every time, obviously, we've just had the Euros this summer, and I think it shows, how the nation is pulled towards football. And I think generally, like, everybody usually is supporting their own clubs. And the Euros is the one time, obviously, we have multiple nationalities living in the country, but it's the one time in which 99% of the nation are pulling together to support England, one club, one unity. And it shows that, the impact that has on communities up and down the country in terms of if you tried to go into a pub during the Euros to watch a game, you'll know how much the community was engaged in that tournament. And that was free football. And that's not just because it's England. That's because of how close we are to football as a nation, not just obviously at a national level, but also obviously at a club by club level.
I think absolutely. I think if you extend that to, we don't even just have to limit that to England. You saw the huge support of Scotland for those, as well as because this is a multicultural nation, and rightly so. We saw celebrations of all the nations that were within the Euros, and we don't just, of course, limit this to men's football as well. We've had very successful women's Euros, even on home soil, that have gone down incredibly well. And football gets a lot of flack for a lot of very, very good reasons. And there are a lot of things wrong with it. And this is precisely why we need things like the index. But actually, there are plenty of things to shout about that are positives as well. And that's really been the key emphasis of the index. So much is made on clubs that are, we're seeing a growing number of clubs that are receiving points deductions or real financial scrutiny on the men's professional side, particularly within England. But we want to celebrate those that do things slightly differently. and that doesn't just have to be, how much money is being made at the end of the day, or what the eventual finishing point on the league table is. That there's so much more to football than that.
Oh, 100%. I think it's interesting to talk about things to celebrate. Obviously, the Spanish had a lot to celebrate this summer. England fans and Scotland fans, not so much. Obviously, the women's team, especially the English women's team, has been doing fantastic the last few years. So at least, we have the one side of the game flourishing, and it is really developing really strongly. In terms of obviously how the index works, there's obviously people that scored really well, and we just talked about who should we be celebrating. So the index was released today. We see that Celtic have done absolutely brilliantly, smashed out the park. We can see Scotland in general have outperformed English clubs. And as a rule, those clubs who are operating as a PLC, so a public limited company, have also really scored well. What is the reason behind this? Why do these clubs, this country in Scotland and sort of PLCs in general, score really well this year?
Yeah, sure. So I think there are two key points there, really, and they both relate to sort of the two largest pillars of the index. So the way the index is split out of the 100 points, financial sustainability is 40 points, good governance is 30, equality standards 20, and fan and community engagement 10. All of them incredibly important, but naturally scoring well in those two bigger pillars, taking up 70%, is going to inherently improve your score. This is how the index has always been, and it spells off a lot of academic rigor that actually, with the likes of fan and community engagement, because of the good things about it, it actually has quite a lot of large indirect effect on the other pillars. So although it only accounts for 10 points, in real terms, it actually has a far greater impact on the overall score of the index. We'll start with the finances, because that's what we know a bit better. Celtic have not only just, as you say, slightly won this, they have absolutely walked it. I'm an academic and work with students all the time, and we're always talking about, how do you gain that first class grade? First class is always 70%. We live now, based on this index, only one club in that whole 206 club study is getting a first class. What that implies to me is that we firstly have raised the bar on what we expect from football clubs, as entities, as a community asset, as a business. But equally, it means that we can really celebrate Celtic, that they are doing things really quite differently. Celtic sit in I believe, almost perfect position to score well on the index in two main ways. Firstly, we're all well aware that they are richer than every other club in Scotland. That they receive a higher level of attendance. They have a huge community program. They are recognised around the world, most notably in North America, due to the huge sort of Irish immigration that was across to the US. They love having a connection with where their ancestors were from. Celtic was born out of Irish immigration into Scotland, and so there's a huge connection there. So we have a huge representation of Celtic as a club. On the more financial details, because they win the league every year, they have access to greater level of resource than others. So all broadcasting deals are weighted, though, that where you finish in the table, you get more money. Unsurprisingly, Celtic are on the television, particularly on the Sky Sports deal, a lot more than a lot of other clubs. Obviously, them and Rangers, most notably, and it's where they're putting that money in. So they are making a profit, which is very, very rare within English and Scottish football, but significantly less rare in Scotland. We'll come on to that though. As a result, they then get access to European money, which is money that is very, very lucrative, is very important to how these clubs run. But they're not just pumping it into player wages. That there's a far greater level of scrutiny, it's far more sophisticated at Celtic than many other, not just clubs in Scotland, but clubs probably across the globe. So really quite impressive on that one. The other side that makes them score very well is in good governance. And this is probably due to the fact they're a PLC, as we say, a public limited company. The reason this is important is that public limited companies face a far greater scrutiny on their processes and them as an organisation than we typically see in limited companies. So we don't have too many PLCs within English and Scottish football. We did see a huge rise rise of them in the 1990s, and then very much went back down to it again. So Tottenham Hotspur used to be a PLC, for example. I believe Sheffield United used to be, and there was a few other clubs in the 90s that have reverted back to sort of what we would consider, well, a private limited company, sort of the more standard business type that we've got in today's world. Being a public limited company is very expensive. It's an awful lot to provide that level of detail and that level of accountability all the time, every quarter, as opposed to every year, as we would expect in a private limited company. But naturally, it means that they're a far greater run organization because they have to run this level of accountability. So one thing that we'd be love to recommend to lots of clubs is not necessarily to all become PLCs, because it's incredibly expensive to do so, but start acting like it. So start thinking about what a PLC would run, how they would hold things to account, what does their board look like, what do the policies associated with the club actually mean. And this is why Celtic have done extremely well. They score, I believe, the highest in Scotland in the total fan index, the total fair game index, sorry, financial sustainability, good governance, and I believe potentially even equality standards as well within Scotland. So a really, really impressive set of criteria there, where they remain pretty much unrivaled. You think about the finances of Scotland themselves. A lot of people will cite the difference between England and Scotland financially. We have huge broadcasting deals for the Premier League, but also the largest for a lower division TV deal anywhere in the world in the form of the EFL deal for the Championship, League One and League Two. Even the National League is receiving, greater sums of money than we would see in the fifth tier equivalent in other major footballing nations. Very rarely would you get to. We now live in a world where the English National League, Tier 5, I think it's something like 22 out of 24 of the clubs are professional. In other big nations of other big footballing nations, so Spain and Italy and France and even Germany are all semi-pro by the third or fourth tier. So the fact that England is housing so many clubs operating at a professional level is to be applauded, and that's due to the huge, obviously, interest in football at all levels and the historic links across the country to that. But what we don't see in Scotland that we do in England is actually massive cliff edges in the finances between these leagues. We all know about the huge amount of money that gets for those that win the Championship playoffs to get promoted into the Premier League. It's often called something like the £180 million gain, because that's how much money they're pretty much guaranteed to get, even if they go straight back down the following year. And what that creates is a gambling culture throughout English football. The idea that if we spend a little bit more now and push it just a little bit further, we might get promoted and therefore get access to far greater resources. It's unsurprising that so many clubs in the Championship score so poorly on financial sustainability within our index, because so many of them are taking that push, plus, of course, all the other conversations around things like parachute payments. In Scotland, what we have is more of a sort of a ramp between these leagues. So there is a difference. We are seeing, the Premiership earns more than the Championship, and the Championship earns more than League One, so to speak, of course. But why are you doing it? What money are they actually looking for? The financial gulf between Celtic and Rangers and the rest of Scotland is huge. We're talking 5-6 times the budget at pretty much any one time. So what does that mean for us, for a club that isn't named Celtic and Rangers? Well, what that means is that you're fighting for third. And actually, within Scottish football, third still gets you European football. Now, okay, it's not necessarily the Champions League, but the Conference League is earning more and more money each year, as is the Europa League, and can do very, very well for a club of with revenues that are comparable with sort of the bottom end of the Championship, top end League One, as we see within Scotland. What that means is there's no gambling culture, because what are you gambling on? The finances available to try and push for a Rangers and a Celtic is wildly behind, so far ahead that it's not worth it. So the budgets of Aberdeen and Hibs and Hearts and Motherwell and everyone else in the Scottish Premiership is a little bit more, and the range of them is significantly smaller than what we see in the Premier League. As a result, because there's nothing not to fight for, because there's plenty to fight for, but that level of lunacy, to be honest, that we see within English football just isn't there. So they're more fiscally responsible. And that's why the financial resources, the financial sustainability scores within the NX for Scottish clubs is far better, because they're not gambling on a future that isn't there. They know, just more reason and more logic is generally applied to Scottish football, because that allure of, if we get to that next level, we'll earn even more money, just isn't really there. There's still some ambition, of course there is, but it's those huge gulfs that really create that gambling culture, something that within English football I think we need to alleviate. And actually, what this proves is that there's an awful lot that English clubs can learn from clubs across the border.
Now, really interesting. It is obviously, it's a negative for Scottish football in terms of the control in which those two clubs have. But in terms of how that impacts the rest of the league, if essentially Celtic and Rangers were more in line with the other clubs across Scotland, the sustainability would also be far greater, because essentially everyone is on a level playing field, and that's sort of how the rest of Scotland act, or how the clubs end up competing, because they know they're competing against those with relatively equal budget. So it's almost like a more equal playing field. And people are acting far more sustainably, and not just financially, like you say. It's across all the metrics of the index. We spoke about the clubs there that obviously, especially sort of like reflecting back onto the English clubs who have, due to their environment as well as their own practices, scored worse than what the clubs have done in Scotland. But rather than picking out specific clubs that have necessarily scored poorly, generally, how can clubs improve their sustainability, or not necessarily just improve their sustainability, but ensure that metrics like the Fair Game Index, and ensure that regulators and etc., when they come to measure and audit the clubs, how can they improve their scores moving forward?
It's all about transparency for me. So as much as we're a measure of metrics that people recognize, say finances, there are lots of people that cover the finances of football these days, and rightly so. It provides a lens that I think the average football fan didn't really have access to, even as recently as 5 years ago. And there's people like Kieran Maguire that do a fantastic job of that, and makes no bones about that. But actually, from a transparency is all what fans really, and all stakeholders, are ultimately looking for. And the index is as much a measure of that as it is sort of sustainability of the game. Because for us as Fair Game, transparency is sustainability. If you hold people to account, things will get better over time. The only way you can hold account is if you're telling people truly what's going on underneath. So actually, that's really been sort of the overwhelming point on all of it, is that, so for finances, we'll use that for, go back to the data again. Finance is a really good example of this, is that you can score better if you publish a full set of accounts rather than an abbreviated set, because you're showing us more than you did before. Now, not necessarily every club will score better if you publish full accounts, because ultimately, if you're losing a load of money, that's still unsustainable. But it's nice of you that you've told us that. As opposed to what we currently see within lower leagues is, because there's no legal need. So off the top of my head, there is no need to publish full accounts for anything less than, I think it's 10.2 million, or an equity of a number that escapes me. Point is, there are certain figures that by law, once you hit that threshold, you have to publish full accounts as a private limited company. And a lot of clubs are below that threshold. And it keeps them protected. And we can sort of understand there's the huge additional resource cost of having that full investigation sometimes. But as we mentioned before, that they are actually giving these finances already to the league. So in different details and things like that, but is still something that is there. Are you showing someone else? Are you actually telling us that we want to learn from this? Because as much as if one club starts doing it, it's hard to sort of maintain. But actually, if we saw, and this is where it comes back to government regulation potentially, is that if everybody's doing it at the same time, you don't feel like you're losing a competitive edge. Everyone feels that there are greater connection to the clubs, and there's a greater accountability to who are the people running their football clubs. And there's lots of conversations that's far greater than this podcast today on the type of ownership and who is owning football, Today, that's massively changed in the last 30 years. We've seen some real good. We've also seen some real bad. Of course, we have. But the fact that we could see that at an earlier point would be useful. But also, if everyone is transparent, you can learn off each other. There's we have conversations with clubs and staff members within the clubs all the time, and some of the stories are fantastic. We were talking to people who will go and speak to their respective, their equivalent job at other clubs at match days and things like that, and they learn from best practice. But if we're in a position where everyone is transparent, we can encourage that between everybody. And not only will you improve because you've got all the practices and all the knowledge you've got, you're also able to source the knowledge from other people. And overall, football itself will improve, because I think football generally feels like every club is rightfully special, and that we do things differently, and we are special. And to an extent, that's true. But equally, there's so much that 95% of clubs are exactly the same. What is different is the community and the people within them. But actually, why are you involved in football? That all comes down to the love of the game and the love of your local community. That has no reference to a particular location. And you can learn so much more from it. And as a result, your community will improve and your football club will improve. And it might lead to 2 or 3 more wins a season. That's always a nice added benefit as well. And actually, there's so much more that the clubs can do. So yeah, very much all down to transparency.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I think in terms of the importance for fans, I think the sort of appetite to understand what's going on behind the scenes of football clubs has massively increased. Obviously, especially with everything that happened with the European Super League. I think clubs at one point, because owners, there was an understanding that the owners are custodians of their clubs. They're not really owners. They just essentially house it for the fans, and they invest their money to try and move the club forward. But ultimately, they understand that the club is owned by the fans. The way in which football has massively developed, especially since sort of the early 90s, we've sort of found a larger disconnect, and sort of decision making at some football clubs has really not been in line with what the fans would want. So it gets to a point where there's less trust now in terms of what football boards are now doing at sort of behind the scenes level compared to what fans were expecting, and therefore they sort of demand a higher level of transparency because there's less trust. And the funny thing is once you start to become more transparent, that trust rebuilds, and then there's less. It sort of snowballs really positively. When we come to look at the index, and a lot of people will be scanning through the index and they'll be thinking, Jesus, how has that club gone there? And how that club is more sustainable than that club. How is that the case? So just to sort of reassure those fans who are looking at this thinking, that doesn't feel right, or that club should be more sustainable from that club based on what I'm hearing on social media or what I'm hearing here and there. What can you sort of tell fans about the sort of how the sort of questions were populated, who came up with the questions that were put forward, how was the data then collected, and then what was sort of the audit process, or how was this sort of all checked and regulated to ensure that the data that's used within this index is reliable and is accurate?
Of course. So, as you say, to firstly reiterate, all data that's been collected is publicly available. And this actually sort of already creates problem number one for some clubs. What we saw throughout all of the data collection process, and this is particularly applicable to good governance and equality standards on things like, let's say, individual policies, the things that we want clubs to be, not only do they have them written, but actually sticking to them and making the overall environment of working within that club far, far better. And actually, we saw quite a few of them that would potentially release a statement or allude to a policy that actually we couldn't find. So this was often through 2 main reasons. One of them would either be that the policy was never written, and it's just a not in a malicious way, but it's things like, we should have one of these, so we're gonna mention it. But actually, when was the last time it was updated? When was the last time it was actually written? When was the last time it was even signed and sort of checked that it's still appropriate with the modern world? Who's to say how many, say, working policies, how many of them actually allude to working from home, which is a very common thing that we see within modern industry now. Are these types of things being considered? Or are they, and have they got them written down? Is there a level of accountability? The other one we've often seen is because these, particularly with club websites, which of course has been a major source for a lot of these policies and a lot of the information we've collected, a lot of websites rightfully get updated as time goes on. And actually, we see quite a few companies, quite a few clubs have redone their websites in the last 3 to 4 years, often by either a third party. So a lot of the EFL clubs all use the same provider, and that's why lots of club websites all look very, very similar. The club colours are changed, and of course the content is different, but ultimately the format's the same. And what that means is when those websites got updated, we would quite regularly reach links to, let's say it was an individual policy that we were looking for, we want to score them on and hold them against. It takes us to a 404 page not found link because that link has been severed through the update of the website. But that's, to us, is part of the problem, is the fact that they've gone, well, it's there, but actually no one's checked it recently enough to see that actually it's not working. And therefore, what kind of accountability does that really set to the club? So that's one side. So that's more of a sort of a technical issue that we have within that. In terms of the questions set were from leading academics in a lot of the, well, in all of the pillars that we're looking at. Fair Game is as a collection of clubs, but it's also a collection of stakeholders within football. And also we call upon a lot of leading academics in a variety of spheres. As a result, we're research led on the types of questions being set. So within finances, it's sourced from very, very leading football finance experts, both from an academic point of view, but also in the world of business, to actually go, well, what types of business measures and financial measures are used regularly, incorporating beyond football, but also adding some more sport-specific measures within that, of actually going, well, this is the fairest reflection of financial sustainability. Because if you go down the traditional route of what is financially sustainable, if you looked at a different industry, you wouldn't take into consideration the fact that every business makes a loss. There are two types of industry there's two types of businesses that budget for a loss: startups and football clubs, and that's it. In a weird way, many football clubs who continue to make a loss are 125-year-old startups in some weird ways. It's because, as a result, traditional ways of measuring, is this club profitable or what is this club worth, it's really hard to do when none of them are making any money. That's the type of thing that we look at. So that's why we have to take into some slightly different variables to really measure it. Again, all still publicly available information. In terms of your final point on, what do we do if the fans or people are going, oh, I'm surprised that club has scored where it has. And firstly, if you think there's something there and it's publicly available, we want to hear about it. We want to see the Fair Game Index is constantly about continual improvement. With the finances, for example, we're having to, we're looking at this as the Fair Game Index 2024, recorded on the 22nd of August 2024 when the report goes out. But actually, we're having to rely on finances just due to the nature of business for the finances of clubs from the 22-23 season. So if we had greater regulation and greater transparency, we'd love to be able to use the finances of the most recent seasons. But ultimately, it's not currently publicly available. So that's the other thing. And the final point on that is, if you're thinking, well, my club should be doing better at this, my club should be doing that, hold the ownerships to account. Call for these things, look for these policies, ask after them, and actually start to really dig into whether these reports are out there and whether the things that should matter to you as a stakeholder are actually being done on a regular basis and actually having something about it. Not just do we have it, but are we using it? Are we building this? Are we learning from outside the industry? Environmental policy is a massive one for this, where we go not just, oh, we want to be carbon neutral by 2050, which is often the line is often fired at from all industries, but actually going, what is my club doing to actually achieve this? Is it beyond the buzzword? What more can I ask from them? Now, you can either do that as an individual fan, or many clubs have community trusts, and therefore you're effectively a fans union, and you really might get some great results. And the only thing that will come out of that is you will have a more transparent club who are more focused on trying to improve your connection to the club, and really that there are no downsides to that.
I think it's really interesting the point around profitability in football, because obviously this is going to sound strange to a lot of people, but one of the things in which makes football so investable is the amount of losses that are made. And what I mean is by that is a lot of football clubs are now owned by business owners that make a lot of money. You have to make a lot of money to afford these sort of football clubs. But if you're making a lot of money, that usually means that you're also paying a lot of tax. So if there's a way in which you can invest your money into an entity that, although yes, is going to cost you a lot of money, but will increase in value, if you can take a football club and spend £100 million on it, but take it from League Two up to the Championship, let's say, for example, it may have cost you £200 million to do that, or any number you want to pull out of the sky. The value of the asset that you'll own will far be greater than the money that you've put into it. So it's a really strange business in that sense, in terms of the reason why lots of people invest into it is because it makes losses. And although you've seen in recent years a lot of American owners come into sort of English football, especially. However, sort of America have now sort of closed that tax loophole where they're now saying that where you're paying the money is where the tax has to be paid, and therefore it's not the same workaround as it used to be. So I think we'll see a far lower demand of American ownership in English football and Scottish football as well over the next few years. But it's really interesting how different football is to any other business, and that's why reports like this, looking into the nuances of how the football clubs can operate sustainably within its ecosystem. How does the ecosystem need to develop in order to sort of house a more sustainable future for the game? It's really interesting. So going on that, it sort of ties into sort of a few sort of relatively closing points where we come into the end of our time. Is where do we see sort of the future of the index? And then also sort of more generally, where do we see the future of the game? Obviously, we've got the independent regulator building speed. What are your sort of hopes for firstly the index? How does that continue to improve? How does that continue to become a more even further rigorous measure of football's off-pitch performance? But also, like I say, the game more generally, where do we see the future of football?
Sure. So for me, the Fair Game Index will continue to develop. We want not necessarily more touch points or more things to look at, but actually the quality of what we're looking at to ever improve. This is an academic exercise at the end of the day, and we know that there are things that are missing. So as we've already mentioned, we'd love to be able to use for the Fair Game Index 2024 to be using the 23-24 financial data. So we'd love over time that this data would become more readily available more quickly for all businesses. As a result, we know we can measure the actual true financial sustainability of the clubs in a far quicker light than we currently do. What also we'd like to see is, I'd love to expand this to not just England and Scotland. Welsh football is always talked about, I think, more as an afterthought, unfortunately, and really it shouldn't be, because ultimately fans of a Welsh club are just as important as a fan of an English and Scottish club. Do we look at do we extend that, of course, then to Northern Ireland, and then do we look at the Republic, and then do we look at Europe, and do we look at football as a global game? And what we don't just have to learn from what's going on this particular British Isle. We can learn from across the continent, which is and across the globe as well. So hopefully we would continue to expand the amount of clubs we look at. We'd love to look at the quality of new measures. Do we investigate football constantly changes. So there's constantly conversations about, we talk about sponsorship within English football. For example, where is that money coming from? We used to see lots that were related to cigarettes, then that got banned. Then we had alcohol, and then that got banned. There's talks of that with gambling, but where do we sit in the world of cryptocurrency? Where do we sit in the world of connected sponsorship to regimes that don't fully align with the Western world? Is that necessarily a bad thing? Is that necessarily a good thing? These types of measures to really look into the financial and the sustainable nature of it, the use of football by all political persuasions as a vehicle for messaging. Some of them very, very good. Some of them you might perceive as not quite as good. You know, is that really football's place? Is it really a place for politics? If it is, in what capacity? Why not? You know, for me, they're permanently intertwined, but I'd love to be able to properly investigate that relationship and the index to really delve into that. Not necessarily to make a judgment call on you have done it wrong or you have done it right, but actually just a greater understanding of how football is connected to its community on a national and local level. And the other one that I think would be really good to look at is a greater greater discussion on the women's game. You know, ultimately these reports have been looking predominantly at the men's game. More data is available. Arguably, it's in a greater mess than the women's game at present. But that doesn't mean that the women's game shouldn't be analysed in its own dedicated way. For me, there are obviously lots of similarities, but to just label it as the same thing probably doesn't do anybody any good. And so there will be new and different variables to look at to appreciate within the women's game, of which we can then build on going, well, this is working well in the women's game, but it's not working well in the men's game. What can we do to make this better? Because it is not just a case of women following in the footsteps of men firmly, you know, it rightfully is as much the other way round. And actually going, what can we learn from the women's game? And then what can we learn from other sports? There might be another one as well. You know, we look at sport and football being the most talked about sport anywhere in the world. But what can we learn from the world of cricket? What can we learn from the world of rugby union, for example? So there's an awful lot there in terms of what the index could become. In terms of how I think the world of football will continue, in a weird way, the true success of football growing is that where we don't need the fair game index in some weird sadistic way. It's the idea that football has reached it is transparent, it is held to account. You know, the independent regulator uses the fair game index as a measure of the clubs to hold them. You know, there is a level of accountability, but potentially linking it to financial redistribution. You know, football within but continues to get richer at all levels of the pyramid. But actually, when that money is being redistributed, is it being redistributed fairly? What are we considered as fair? And actually, if the regulator is in charge of financial distribution for things, I would like to see in a world where the good guys are getting the money, and that money is being ring fenced for things that matter to the local community and that matter from a business position, and not just going entirely into player wages on the hope that if we keep everything else the same, we might get promoted and it'll all be okay. No, that there is an element of that, and I don't think we should close it off entirely to the world of player wages. If football becomes richer, those who are driving the revenue deserve to be paid accordingly. But, you know, that we everyone goes to better quality facilities, that money can then go better into the community trust, so more people are involved in sport, and those fan foundations are getting the money needed to get people active and to get people connected to football generally. So I think we're still, despite lots of worries about where the world of football is going, I actually think there's still an awful lot of positives that are still yet to be realised, and it's not going away anytime soon. So let's see what we can do to shape it in the best possible image.
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting stuff. It's a brilliant report. We've obviously we've both done a lot of work on this, in all fairness, but especially yourself, Adam, put a lot of hours into this piece of work. And I really do encourage everyone to check out the index, listen to your thoughts. For everybody watching this, we'll be hosting a live Q&A, myself and Adam, on Friday at 10 a.m., I believe. But there'll be a link below. It's within a closed community, Goal Assist community. If you join up with that, you'll get access to the Q&A as well as a bunch of other cool stuff. And if you'd like to ask any questions around the index, I do really encourage you to get involved, ask your questions. When starting this podcast series, we did not want to be a podcast. The issue with the podcast is, from the research I did, everybody loves them. But the issue is, a lot of the time, that podcasts only discuss holistic topics and not necessarily things that are close enough to home or don't answer the questions that you like. And also, it's the fact that it's great being able to talk and hear the advice from these people, but you'd never actually get to build a network with these people. And we all know, to get ahead, especially in the world of football business, networking is really key. I mean, it's key across all industries, but especially within the football industry. So we wanted to create a community in which doesn't only provide information in entertaining and informative ways, but also allows you to build that community. So really, I do highly recommend get involved, join the community, join the Q&A session tomorrow morning, and it'll be really interesting to see what questions you come up with, because I'm sure you've got loads, especially after reading this index. And like Adam says, any questions you have, we want to ask, and any sort of queries you have, ask away, because it'll be, the more eyeballs that are on this stuff, it's only better for the game, because it's only going to cause more transparency. It's going to allow us to think in different ways and allow us to, understand, be closer to the fans, be closer to people in industry, and to, really help improve the product of the index moving forward. To sort of finish up then, Adam, have you got any sort of closing sort of message you'd like to send to the football community? Obviously, where can people find you? If anybody would like to work with yourselves, obviously with your consultancy work that you've been doing across the industry, and obviously not just football, but obviously across all sports, where can people get in touch?
Yeah, no problem at all. Well, first off, thank you very much for having me, and I hope those that listened found it useful, or at least interesting. And arguably, I hope it has raised more questions, because that, to me, is the most interesting part. So you can find me, as I say, I'm a lecturer of the University campus of Football Business, so UCFB in Manchester. My email for that is a.davis@ucfb.ac.uk, but you can find me on LinkedIn. It's just Adam Davis. I have it down that, but of course it's got my website as well, which is davissportsmanagement.com. So there's lots of ways to find me. I'm always keen to have any conversation with anyone about these sort of things. So I really look forward to having more and more conversations on this. Of course, if you want to get involved, we're already looking at the excitement of potentially what we can do next year. And if you think that sounds like something that you want to contribute to, get in touch with Josh and myself, and you can come be part of hopefully what we see as a real excitement in the world of football. So looking forward to hearing from anyone and everyone.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for your time today, Adam. Like I say, join the community, get involved. We want to be as connected to you guys as possible. We don't want this to be sort of like a closed shop. We want to be as close to our community as possible. So please join. Thanks again massively to Adam. Really insightful, really interesting. This is going to be one of the biggest news stories in football business of the year. It'll be across all your major sporting platforms. I know a lot of people who are watching this probably heard about the index via ITV News or Sky Sports or wherever else you'll be hearing this. And it's great that you've been able to sort of share a light on the intricacies, how it works, how it's collected, the challenges that the Fair Game Index is trying to sort of bring light to, and interesting to hear where you think football's moving forward. But again, sorry, just thanks again for coming on, and we'll see you next time.